What's up guys, Sci-Fi Guy 2094 here. Today I'm going to do a quick video on James Gunn's DCEU. So I'm just going to call it DCEU because he's not rebooting the entire thing. He's keeping Peacemaker as part of this universe. He's also bringing back Shazam, Wonder Woman, Amanda Waller, Blue Beetle. The only person he really wanted to get rid of was Henry Cavill. So I think it's kind of weird that he's deciding to soft reboot instead of hard reboot. So I'm going to call it DCEU because a lot of the events are just going to be the same with a slight difference, mainly regarding Superman, and I think a lot of the other characters are going to be the same. So I'm just going to call it DCEU for the sake of this video because it relates to the old universe. If it was a hard reboot, sure, I'd say, okay, yeah, we can call this a separate universe, but I'm just going to refer to it as James Gunn's DCEU because it's still the extended universe, the DC extended universe. He's keeping some events the same. He's soft rebooting, which is kind of weird. I feel like it should just be a hard reboot. That way you don't have baggage from the other films, but him and Peter Safran are in charge, and that's the way they decided to do it. So, for the new James Gunn and Peter Safran DC films, here's what I kind of want, here's what I expect. So they're kind of trying to copy Marvel because of Marvel's success, which is they're doing phases, right? So he's calling phase 1 God and Monsters. And so what Warner Brothers should have done previously, they didn't really have anyone leading the studio. It was kind of just the executives making all the decisions. They should have just copied Marvel back then, right after Man of Steel. They should have just saw what Marvel was doing, basically copied their formula and took their time and then built up to the Justice League film. So I think this time around they kind of have the right idea with at least somebody's leading the studio now. It's two people leading the studio, whereas before Warner Brothers was just making all the decisions, and probably a few people at DC were making some decisions, but they didn't have anyone in creative control. Some people say Zack Snyder was in charge of DC. He never had creative control of DC. Basically, Warner Brothers told him what to do. He didn't really have much leeway on, how he wanted the universe to go in a certain direction. For example, with Justice League, basically Warner Brothers said, okay, you have to introduce Cyborg, Flash, and Aquaman in this film, which already had Batman and Wonder Woman, which we knew from Batman v Superman. And they're like, okay, you gotta introduce all these other characters and it has to be under 2 hours. So we kind of saw how that worked out, and then obviously Zack had to step away, and then Joss Whedon came in and reshot everything. So a lot of people think Snyder had control, they think he was in charge of DC. For some reason some people think that, but he really wasn't. He didn't have much say and he didn't have much creative control, unfortunately. So I do think that Warner Brothers is kind of doing a better strategy now, with at least having two people co-lead instead of just one person making all the decisions. So it's James Gunn and Peter Safran. Peter Safran worked on the X-Men films, the Fox X-Men films, and obviously James Gunn worked for Marvel. So here's what I'm kind of expecting with God and Monsters. It's going to be Superman, Supergirl, Batman. I think they're doing a Swamp Thing, and then they're doing a couple other projects. Hopefully they just establish these characters in this universe. We just get an idea and sense of who they are, and then hopefully they have some run-ins with several villains. Obviously we see Lex is in this new Superman film, And hopefully in stage two or phase two, whatever they want to call it, hopefully we can see um, maybe Lex Luthor forming the Legion of Doom. We in the previous universe we saw him alluding to the he wanted to start a league of his own. So hopefully we can actually see the Legion of Doom. Hopefully we get some good villains, and maybe in this universe, in this world where we see heroes are already out in the open and they're operating, hopefully there's a good enough reason for Lex to form this Legion of Doom. Maybe he thinks that superheroes are becoming too dangerous, or maybe he thinks that they need to be kept in check. Maybe he's gonna conspire with the government and they're gonna fund the Legion of Doom. Hopefully there can be some politics in superhero films. Some people are worried about Superman Legacy being a little bit too political, but you look at the Marvel films, there's a ton of politics in Marvel films. Like, if you look at Winter Soldier, as well as Civil War, very political films. Obviously, anything Captain America is going to have some politics in it. Even a Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, he had to freaking go to Senate hearings. There was some politics in that. So, I think they're going to do well, at least I hope they're going to do Legion of Doom. I'm not saying it has to be like political, because I don't think Lex would want to work with any governments. He kind of likes to do his own thing, but I would like to see him form a Legion of Doom, and I'd love to see them go up against the Justice League. So, we already have established characters. There's not going to be any origin stories in this universe, so, I feel like that would be a good phase two. After we get our introduction to all these characters and they get their solo films as well as sequels from the previous universe, because I think they're doing a Wonder Woman 3 and a Shazam 3. So, we'll have to see how all that works out. Flash shifted the timeline, so some events didn't happen and some did happen. We're going to find out. I guess nobody's going to know this version of Kal-El, so it'll be kind of like a fresh slate for them, and they can form the League eventually, because they're going to have to, because, hopefully we see the Legion of Doom. Now we got to talk about this Flash situation, because Grant Gustin has stated he wants to be the Flash in this new universe. Last we saw, the timeline was reset. We saw George Clooney, and it was seemingly still going to be Ezra Miller. Now, obviously, Ezra Miller's crazy antics outside of Hollywood can't be ignored, and Warner Brothers does not want to work with him again. So, James Gunn wants him back. Warner Brothers has no plans to work with him. So, we're going to have to see how they do this thing with the Flash. It makes sense that they're just going to recast him, because, it's kind of an altered timeline, as we saw at the end of his film. And let's just be honest, there's not going to be any George Clooney. He is not going to be the Batman for The Brave and the Bold. He's not going to be the Batman. That was just like a little throwaway cameo they wanted to throw in there, just kind of like the Michael Keaton being in the film The Flash, is because they couldn't market it as a Flash film because of all the antics of Ezra Miller. So we'll see what happens with the Flash and him joining the League and all those things. What I'm kind of hoping is they kind of start this universe off like the animated New 52, where the heroes all kind of come together pretty early on, but they don't necessarily know each other and they haven't worked together too well. Because in Justice League War, the New 52, that's probably like the second film, starting with Flashpoint, which rebooted the universe. You had the Flashpoint Paradox, and then you had Justice League War, which was, the the follow-up, basically. They hadn't worked together, but you have this parademon invasion, you have Darkseid as a threat, so they all had to team up. I think that would be a good idea if James Gunn wants to go in that direction, because again, you don't have to go over all the origin stories and all that stuff. It's just, okay, the heroes are here, they're operating. He's going to establish that Superman legacy. We see Mr. Terrific, we see Green Lantern, which is what is his name? Guy Gardner. We have Hawk Girl. So I just hope there's not too many characters in this film. Hopefully it's not too overstuffed with characters and plots, kind of like some things in Batman v Superman. And I don't know what they're going to do with Hawkman, because Hawkman already appeared in Black Adam, so I don't know if they're going to recast that Hawkman or bring him back. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of like my expectations, my kind of hopes for this new DC cinematic universe going forward. I'd like to see them, face their own villains, go through their own challenges, kind of work with a couple other heroes here and there, but for the most part, hopefully they stay in their own lane. And then hopefully in phase 2 we can get a more of team up type films with them going against the Legion of Doom. I'd love to see Gorilla Grodd. I'd love to see Bane. I'd love to see Sinestro and Metallo. So I think that would be cool. And Cheetah, I think they may have used Cheetah in Wonder Woman 84. I'm not sure, but I think they used her, because I'm not sure, I haven't watched that movie. So, I want to see Legion of Doom super, super badly. I think it would be really awesome for them to do that. But anyway, that's just my, kind of just like my initial thoughts on the new DC films. And I hope they take a nice different approach and introducing these characters. Just initially, get a sense of who they are, which is, we never really got that. And, well, we did in some of the old films from the previous DCEU, but, it wasn't expanded upon too much. So hopefully they do that for these new films by James Gunn. And, yeah, that's what I would love to see. So comment down below what you guys think, and I will see you next time.